Imagine standing at the edge of a vast canyon, watching the slow dance of shadow and light as the sun traces its ancient arc across the sky. The rock beneath your feet took millions of years to form, carved grain by water that never hurried, never forced, never demanded that stone yield before its time. And yet here it stands, this monument to patience, this testament to the power of gentle persistence. The river that carved it didn't rage against the mountain. It simply continued, day after day, century after century, until the impossible became inevitable. Now imagine yourself in a traffic jam, fingers drumming against the steering wheel, jaw clenched, feeling that familiar tightness in your chest as minutes tick by like hours. Or picture yourself waiting for a text message that never comes, refreshing your email for the 10th time in as many minutes, feeling that gnawing anxiety that perhaps you've been forgotten, overlooked, left behind. Notice the difference between these two experiences of waiting. One carved canyons, the other carves ulcers. This is the paradox of patience in the modern age. We live in a world that has declared war on waiting, that treats patience not as a virtue, but as an inconvenience to be engineered away. We have same-day delivery, instant messaging, microwave dinners, and speed dating. We can access the sum of human knowledge in seconds, stream any film ever made in moments, and communicate across continents in the time it takes to blink. And yet, somehow, we are more impatient than ever. The very technologies designed to save us time have instead created an expectation that everything should happen now, immediately, without delay. We have gained speed but lost something essential in the process.
For 30 days, you must take control of your mind. It will think about only what you permit it to think about. Don't concern yourself too much with how you're going to achieve your goal. Leave that completely to a power greater than yourself. All you have to do is know where you're going. The answers will come to you of their own accord and at the right time. For 30 days, do your very best. No matter what your job, do it as you've never done it before for 30 days. And if you've kept your goal before you every day, you'll wonder and marvel at this new life you've found.
The ancient Stoic philosopher Seneca observed nearly 2,000 years ago that we are not given a short life, but we make it short. We waste so much of it in impatient rushing, in frustrated waiting, in anxious anticipation. He wrote that life is long if you know how to use it, but we squander it by refusing to accept the pace at which things actually unfold. We rage against the rhythms of reality, demanding that the world conform to our schedule rather than learning to move in harmony with its tempo. What is patience, really? We throw the word around casually, praising it in children and admiring it in others, but do we understand what we're talking about? The word itself comes from the Latin pati, meaning to suffer or endure. Patient originally meant one who suffers, one who bears pain or difficulty with calmness. This etymology reveals something crucial that we've forgotten. Patience is not passive. It's not about doing nothing. It's about bearing something, carrying a weight, enduring discomfort without collapsing into reactivity. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks of patience as one of the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections that lead to enlightenment. But in the Buddhist understanding, patience isn't about gritting your teeth and white-knuckling your way through difficulty. It's about developing the capacity to remain open and present with discomfort, to not harden against experience, to not build walls between yourself and the full texture of reality. The Tibetan word for patience, zopa, contains the sense of being able to withstand, to not be thrown off balance, to remain stable in the face of provocation or difficulty. Think about what happens in your body when you're impatient. Your breathing becomes shallow, your muscles tense, your jaw clenches. Your mind races forward, trying to skip ahead to some imagined future where the thing you're waiting for has already happened. You're physically here, but psychologically, you're somewhere else entirely, and that split creates suffering. Impatience is a form of violence we commit against the present moment. We're essentially saying to reality, "This isn't good enough. You're not moving fast enough. I refuse to be here until you give me what I want." Carl Jung understood that our greatest difficulties in life often stem from our inability to accept what is. He wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. What he meant by this is profound. When we refuse to accept the natural discomfort, the natural pace, the natural unfolding of life, we don't escape suffering. We just trade authentic suffering, the kind that transforms and teaches us, for inauthentic suffering, the kind that keeps us trapped in endless loops of frustration and anxiety. Impatience is inauthentic suffering. It's suffering that serves no purpose, teaches us nothing, and leaves us exactly where we started, only more exhausted. The ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, offers us a different image entirely. He speaks of water as the highest good, precisely because it is patient. Water doesn't force its way through obstacles. It settles into the lowest places that others disdain. It nourishes all things without striving, and yet, given enough time, water carves through solid stone. This is the paradox that impatient cultures forget. The softest thing in the universe overcomes the hardest thing, not through force, not through speed, but through patient persistence. In the modern West, we've inherited a particular relationship with time that shapes our impatience in ways we rarely examine. The Protestant work ethic, which Max Weber analysed so brilliantly, taught us that time is money, that idleness is sin, that every moment must be productive, must be put to use, must generate value. We've internalized this so deeply that waiting feels like theft. When we're stuck in traffic or standing in line, we experience it as stolen time, as if someone has reached into our lives and extracted value from us. But what if waiting isn't stolen time? What if it's simply time, and our relationship with it is what makes it feel stolen? The French philosopher Henri Bergson distinguished between two kinds of time: clock time, which he called spatialized time, the time we measure and divide into equal units, and lived time, durée, the qualitative experience of time as it actually unfolds in consciousness. When we're impatient, we're trapped in clock time, watching the seconds tick by, feeling each one as a burden. But when we're patient, when we're truly present, we slip into lived time, where 5 minutes can feel like an eternity or pass in what seems like an instant, depending not on the clock but on the quality of our attention. Consider the gardener who plants a seed. She knows that no amount of impatient wishing will make that seed sprout faster. She can provide the right conditions, water and sunlight and good soil, but the actual unfolding of the plant happens according to its own internal schedule. There's a wisdom in this that our culture has largely forgotten. Some things simply cannot be rushed. The gardener who digs up the seed every day to check if it's growing will kill the very thing she's trying to nurture. The same is true of so much in life. Relationships have their own pace. Healing has its own schedule. Insight arrives when it's ready, not when we demand it. The psychologist Erik Erikson, in his stages of psychosocial development, identified the first crisis of human life as trust versus mistrust. Infants must learn whether the world is a place that will meet their needs, whether the discomfort of hunger will be followed by the relief of feeding, whether the anxiety of being alone will be soothed by the return of the caregiver. In a sense, this is our first encounter with patience, though we don't have that word for it yet. Can we trust that relief is coming, even when we can't see it? Can we tolerate the gap between need and fulfillment? Some of us learn that the world is reliable, that waiting leads to satisfaction. Others learn that the world is chaotic and unpredictable, and that impatient demanding is the only way to get needs met. These early lessons shape our relationship with patience for the rest of our lives. But here's what's fascinating. We're not doomed to repeat those early patterns. Patience, it turns out, is a skill that can be developed, a muscle that can be strengthened. Neuroscientists have discovered that practices which cultivate patience actually change the structure of the brain, particularly in areas associated with emotional regulation and delayed gratification. The famous marshmallow test, where children were offered the choice between one marshmallow now or two marshmallows, if they could wait 15 minutes, revealed something important, not just about willpower, but about patience. Children who could wait, who could tolerate the discomfort of desire without immediately acting on it, tended to have better life outcomes decades later. But what the follow-up research revealed is even more interesting. The ability to wait wasn't just an innate trait. It was something that could be taught, learned, and cultivated. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught his students to distinguish between what is up to us and what is not up to us. This distinction is the foundation of patience. Almost nothing external is actually up to us. We don't control other people. We don't control outcomes. We don't control the pace at which things happen. All we control is our own mind, our own response, our own choice about where to place our attention. When we try to control things outside our control, we create impatience and frustration. When we focus on what we can actually control, our own thoughts and actions and responses, we create the conditions for patience. Think about how often impatience is really just a disguised form of control. You're impatient in traffic because you believe that somehow your frustration should make the cars move faster. You're impatient with another person because you believe your irritation should make them change. You're impatient with your own progress because you believe your self-criticism should accelerate your growth. But none of these beliefs are true. Your impatience changes nothing except your own experience, and it changes that for the worse. The Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh offers a practice he calls stopping. Not stopping in the sense of ceasing all activity, but stopping in the sense of not running toward the future or away from the past. He teaches that when you're walking, you should walk as if you're kissing the earth with your feet. When you're washing dishes, you should wash dishes as if washing dishes is the most important thing in the world. This is radical patience. It's the patience that doesn't treat the present moment as an obstacle to be overcome, but as the only place where life actually happens. But let's be honest about something. Patience is hard. If it weren't, we wouldn't need to talk about it. There's a reason that every wisdom tradition emphasizes patience, and it's because patience goes against our most basic instincts. We are wired for immediate gratification. Our ancestors who saw food and grabbed it immediately were more likely to survive than those who thoughtfully contemplated whether they really needed that meal. Our nervous systems are designed to respond quickly to threats and opportunities. The problem is that we're living in a world that's vastly different from the one our nervous systems evolved to navigate. The evolutionary psychologist Robert Wright points out that our brains were designed to handle occasional moments of danger, punctuated by long periods of relative calm. But modern life is a constant barrage of stimulation, a never-ending stream of emails and notifications and demands. Our systems are in a chronic state of activation, always anticipating the next thing, never fully settling. This creates a baseline of impatience that colors everything we do. We're physiologically primed to feel like everything is urgent, even when nothing actually is. Consider how much of modern life is designed to exploit our impatience. Advertisers know that if they can make you feel like you need something right now, you're more likely to buy it. Social media platforms know that if they can create a sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, you'll keep checking compulsively. The entire architecture of the attention economy is built on undermining your capacity for patience. It's not an accident, it's a business model. But there's something subversive about patience in this context. When you cultivate patience, you're essentially refusing to participate in the frantic pace that consumer culture demands. You're saying, I don't need to respond immediately to every notification. I don't need to upgrade to the latest model the moment it comes out. I can wait. I can sit with desire without immediately acting on it. This makes you a less profitable consumer, which is perhaps one of the most powerful acts of rebellion available in a capitalist society. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, argued that suffering comes primarily from the relentless demands of the will. We want things constantly, and the gap between wanting and having is where suffering lives. The person who has learned patience, who can tolerate that gap without desperate grasping, has fundamentally transformed their relationship with suffering. They haven't eliminated desire, but they've learned to hold it lightly. Let's explore what happens in that gap, that space between wanting and having. This is where patience lives, but it's also where so much else happens. It's the space where we learn who we are beneath our desires. When you can't immediately satisfy a craving, when you can't immediately escape discomfort, you're forced to be with yourself in a way that immediate gratification never requires. And what you often discover in that space is surprising. Sometimes the desire fades. Sometimes it reveals itself to be less important than you thought. Sometimes something else emerges, a deeper desire that was hidden beneath the surface urgency. The practice of meditation is essentially a laboratory for studying patience. When you sit down to meditate, you're immediately confronted with the mind's impatience. It wants to be somewhere else, doing something else, thinking about something more interesting. The untrained mind is like a toddler at the DMV, squirming and complaining and asking, "Are we done yet?" every 30 seconds. But what meditation teaches is that you don't have to indulge that impatience. You can notice it, acknowledge it, and then gently return your attention to the present moment, again and again and again. This is the essence of patience, the willingness to begin again without frustration. The Japanese concept of gammon captures something about patience that the English word often misses. Gammon means enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. It suggests a kind of noble forbearance, a refusal to be broken by difficulty. This isn't the grim determination of gritted teeth, but something more subtle, a kind of grace under pressure. During times of crisis in Japanese history, gammon has been invoked as a cultural virtue, a way of maintaining composure and community bonds, even in the face of catastrophe. But we have to be careful here. Not all waiting is virtuous. Not all patience is healthy. There's a difference between patience and passivity, between acceptance and resignation. The person who patiently endures an abusive relationship isn't practicing wisdom. They're practicing self-abandonment. The worker who patiently accepts exploitation isn't noble. They're being taken advantage of. True patience requires discernment. It requires knowing when to wait and when to act, when to accept and when to resist. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart made a fascinating distinction between suffering that leads to God and suffering that doesn't. He argued that suffering only becomes transformative when we accept it fully, when we stop fighting against it and instead allow it to work on us. The person who suffers impatiently, who rages against their circumstances while being unable to change them, experiences only the bitterness of suffering without any of its gifts. But the person who suffers patiently, who allows difficulty to soften them rather than harden them, who remains open even in pain, discovers that suffering can be a kind of teacher. This is counterintuitive in a culture that sees suffering as something to be eliminated at all costs. We have a vast pharmaceutical industry dedicated to numbing pain, a self-help industry devoted to promising happiness, and a technology sector focused on convenience. There's nothing wrong with reducing unnecessary suffering, but we've reached a point where we've forgotten that some suffering is necessary, that some discomfort is the price of growth, that some waiting is the condition for depth. Think about how a tree grows. It doesn't grow smoothly and consistently. It grows in response to stress. When the wind blows, the tree develops stronger roots and a more robust trunk. When drought comes, it sends roots deeper in search of water. The very difficulties that seem like they might kill the tree are what make it strong. If you protect a tree from all stress, if you shelter it from wind and water it perfectly, it becomes weak and shallow-rooted. The same is true of us. The patience required to endure difficulty, to wait through challenges, to persist through setbacks, is what develops our character. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who himself endured years of chronic illness and pain, wrote that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. This has become a cliché, but Nietzsche meant something quite specific. He meant that suffering becomes strength only when we metabolize it, when we integrate it, when we transform it into wisdom. The person who suffers impatiently learns nothing accept that suffering is unbearable. The person who suffers patiently discovers their own capacity, their own depth, their own resilience. But let's get practical for a moment. How does one actually cultivate patience in daily life? It's one thing to contemplate patience philosophically. It's quite another to embody it when you're stuck behind a slow walker on a narrow sidewalk, or when your computer freezes during an important deadline. The gap between understanding patience as a concept and practicing it as a living reality is where most of us live most of the time. One approach comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. When you notice impatience arising, you can ask yourself a series of questions. What am I actually frustrated about? Is this within my control? What story am I telling myself about this situation? Often, impatience is fueled by catastrophic thinking. You're not just annoyed that the line is moving slowly. You're telling yourself that this delay will ruin your whole day, that you'll be late, that people will judge you, that something terrible will happen. When you examine these stories, you often find that they're wildly exaggerated. The actual delay is 5 minutes. The story you're telling yourself about the delay is the source of your suffering. Another approach comes from the mindfulness tradition. Instead of trying to make the impatience go away, you turn toward it with curiosity. Where do you feel it in your body? Is it a tightness in your chest, a clenching in your jaw, a restless energy in your legs? When you investigate impatience this way, something interesting happens. It stops being a solid, overwhelming experience and becomes a collection of sensations, thoughts, and impulses. And once you see it that clearly, you have a choice. You don't have to act on it. You can simply be with it until it passes, which it always does. The Stoics had a practice they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. This sounds grim, but it's actually a technique for cultivating patience. The idea is that you regularly imagine things going wrong, delays happening, plans falling apart. Not in a spirit of pessimism, but in a spirit of preparation. When you've already imagined getting stuck in traffic, when you've already mentally rehearsed the project taking longer than expected, when you've already accepted that things rarely go exactly as planned, you're much less likely to be thrown off balance when difficulties actually arise. You've already made space for them in your mind. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, wrote about how he maintained his sanity in conditions of unimaginable horror. One of his key insights was that while he couldn't control his circumstances, he could control his response to them. He could choose patience in the face of brutality. He could choose meaning in the face of meaninglessness. This isn't meant to minimize the horror of what he endured, but to illuminate something profound about human freedom. Even in the most constrained circumstances, we have the freedom to choose our attitude, and that freedom is the foundation of patience. But here's where it gets interesting. Patience isn't just about enduring difficulty. It's also about timing, about knowing when something is ready. The ancient Greeks had 2 words for time, chronos and kairos. Chronos is chronological time, the tick-tock of the clock, 1 second following another in endless succession. Kairos is the right time, the opportune moment, the sense that now is when something should happen. Patience requires attunement to kairos, an intuitive sense of readiness that can't be rushed or forced. Think about a musician learning a difficult piece. They can practice the notes mechanically, drilling the same passages over and over, but at some point the piece isn't truly mastered until something clicks, until their fingers and the music become one, until they're not thinking about the notes anymore but simply playing. That moment of clicking can't be forced. It arrives in its own time. The patient musician trusts this process, continues practicing without anxious striving, and knows that readiness will come when it comes. The impatient musician either gives up too soon or practices with such grim determination that joy is drained from the music. The same principle applies to so much of life. You can't force insight. You can prepare the ground, you can do the work, but the moment of understanding arrives in its own time. You can't force healing. You can support the conditions for healing, but the body and psyche have their own wisdom about pace. You can't force love. You can be open to it. You can cultivate the qualities that make you capable of it, but it blossoms in its own season. The Persian poet Rumi wrote that patience is the key to joy. But what did he mean by that? If you read his poetry, you find that for Rumi, patience isn't passive waiting, it's active receptivity. It's the farmer who tends his field with loving attention, even though he can't make the wheat grow faster. It's the lover who prepares himself to be worthy of love, even though he can't control whether love arrives. It's the mystic who sits in prayer night after night, even though the veil of separation doesn't lift on command. Rumi's patience is pregnant with longing, alive with anticipation, but free from the desperate grasping that destroys what it seeks. In the psychological literature, there's a concept called distress tolerance, the ability to experience and endure negative psychological or emotional states. People with low distress tolerance have difficulty being with discomfort. They immediately reach for something to numb it, distract from it, or make it go away. This is the psychological foundation of many addictions, not just to substances, but to work, shopping, social media, anything that provides quick relief from uncomfortable feelings. Building distress tolerance is essentially building patience, the capacity to be with difficulty without immediately reactively trying to make it stop. But distress tolerance alone isn't quite enough. There's another quality that's necessary, and that's self-compassion. Often our impatience is harshest toward ourselves. We berate ourselves for not learning faster, not healing quicker, not succeeding sooner. We treat ourselves like machines that should be able to perform on command. And we're frustrated when we discover that we're actually complex organisms with needs for rest, integration, and gradual growth. Kristin Neff, one of the leading researchers on self-compassion, has found that people who are kind to themselves during difficulty have much greater resilience than those who are self-critical. Patience toward oneself isn't indulgence. It's the recognition that growth happens in seasons, not on schedules. Let's turn to a different angle. What does neuroscience tell us about patience? It turns out that patience, or more specifically, the ability to delay gratification and tolerate discomfort, is associated with activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, and self-regulation. When we're impatient, when we give in to impulse, it's often because the more primitive parts of the brain, the parts that want immediate reward and immediate relief from discomfort, override the prefrontal cortex's more measured judgment. Here's what's fascinating. The prefrontal cortex doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. This is why teenagers are notoriously impatient and impulsive. Their brains are literally not yet equipped for consistent patience. But this also means that patience is a developmental achievement. It's something we grow into as we mature, assuming we're given the right conditions for that growth. And even in adulthood, the prefrontal cortex can be strengthened. Practices like meditation, cognitive behavioral therapy, and even certain video games designed to build executive function can enhance our capacity for patience at a neurological level. There's also research on what happens in the brain when we wait for something we want. Anticipation activates the brain's reward centers almost as much as actually getting the thing we want. This is why people enjoy looking forward to a vacation almost as much as the vacation itself. Why the weeks before your birthday can feel as good as the day itself. But modern culture has short-circuited this anticipation cycle. When you can have anything immediately, you lose the pleasure of anticipation. The patient person, paradoxically, experiences more joy, not despite the waiting, but because of it. Think about how this plays out with something like binge-watching a television show. When shows were released one episode per week, you had 6 days of anticipation between episodes. You talked about the show with friends. You speculated about what would happen next. You let the story simmer in your imagination. There was a patience built into the structure of television watching. Now, with streaming services, you can watch an entire season in one sitting. And what's interesting is that while you get immediate gratification, you lose the extended pleasure of anticipation. The experience becomes more intense but less satisfying overall. The same principle applies to larger timescales. The person who learns to play an instrument over years develops a different relationship with music than the person who expects to be proficient in weeks. The years of patient practice create depth of appreciation, layers of understanding, and a kind of intimacy with the instrument that can't be rushed. The modern obsession with life hacks and shortcuts and rapid mastery misses this fundamental truth. Sometimes the journey is the destination. Sometimes the waiting is where the real value lies. But let's address a common concern. Doesn't patience mean settling? Doesn't it mean accepting things that should be changed? Doesn't it lead to complacency? This is where we need to distinguish between different types of patience. There's the patience of acceptance, where you recognize that something is beyond your control and you stop fighting against reality. There's the patience of strategic waiting, where you deliberately delay action because you know the time isn't right yet. And there's the patience of persistent effort, where you keep working toward a goal even though progress is slow. Consider the civil rights movement. Was Martin Luther King Jr. patient? In one sense, absolutely. He understood that transforming deeply entrenched systems of injustice would take time. He didn't expect overnight revolution. He was willing to endure setbacks, to persist through disappointment, to maintain faith even when progress seemed impossibly slow. But in another sense, he was profoundly impatient with injustice. His famous letter from Birmingham jail includes the line, "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights." His patience wasn't passive acceptance. It was strategic, persistent, tireless work toward change, combined with an acceptance that the change wouldn't happen according to his personal timetable. This is the kind of patience that changes the world. It's not resignation. It's the ability to hold a long view, to work toward goals that might not be achieved in your lifetime, to plant trees whose shade you'll never sit under. This requires a particular kind of faith, not necessarily religious faith, but faith that the arc of the universe bends toward justice, even if we can't see the bend from where we're standing. The environmental movement requires this kind of patience. Climate change is a crisis that unfolds over decades and centuries. The actions we take now might not show full effects for generations. How do you maintain patient, persistent effort when the feedback loops are so slow? How do you keep working toward a goal whose achievement you'll never witness? This is perhaps one of the greatest challenges of our age, learning to care about long-term consequences in a culture that's optimized for short-term gratification. Indigenous cultures often have this long view built into their worldview. The Haudenosaunee people have a principle called the seventh generation principle, which holds that decisions should be made with consideration for their impact 7 generations into the future. This kind of thinking requires profound patience, a willingness to sacrifice immediate benefit for long-term flourishing, an understanding that you are part of a much larger story than your individual life. But even in our personal lives, this long view matters. Consider the patience required to maintain a long-term relationship. The early stages of romance are easy. Everything is exciting, novel, and intense. But staying together through decades requires a different kind of patience. It requires patience with each other's flaws, patience with the inevitable seasons of distance and reconnection, patience with the ways people change over time. The impatient person in relationships is always looking for the exit when things get difficult, always wondering if there's someone better out there, always treating their partner as if they should be the finished product rather than a work in progress. The patient person understands that intimacy deepens over time, that working through difficulties together creates bonds that surface harmony never could. Or consider the patience required for parenting. Raising a child is perhaps the ultimate exercise in patience. Nothing about it happens on your schedule. Development happens in its own time. You can't force a child to walk before they're ready, to speak before their brain is prepared, to understand concepts before they've reached the appropriate cognitive stage. And yet how much of parenting involves anxious impatience, worrying that your child isn't developing fast enough, comparing them to other children, pushing them to excel in ways that override their natural pace and interests. The patient parent trusts the process, provides support and guidance, and then steps back to let growth happen in its own way and time. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote about attention as a form of prayer. She argued that the quality of our attention is the quality of our soul, and patience, at its deepest level, is a form of attention. It's the ability to attend fully to what is, rather than rushing ahead to what might be or looking back to what was. This kind of attention is increasingly rare in a world designed to fracture our focus into smaller and smaller fragments. Have you noticed how difficult it's become to read a long book, to watch a slow-paced film, to have a conversation without checking your phone? These aren't moral failures. They're the result of having our nervous systems trained for constant stimulation and rapid reward cycles. But they represent a loss, a diminishment of our capacity for the kind of sustained attention that allows for depth, for nuance, for the kind of understanding that only comes through patient engagement with complexity. There's a practice in some Buddhist traditions called sky gazing. You simply sit and look at the sky, not trying to do anything, not trying to achieve any particular state, just looking. It sounds simple, but try it for 5 minutes and you'll discover how difficult it is. The mind wants something to do, some problem to solve, some distraction to chase. Just being with the vast openness of sky, just maintaining that quality of patient attention, reveals how restless we've become. The desert fathers and mothers of early Christianity had a similar practice. They would go into the desert, not primarily to get away from temptation, but to confront themselves without distraction. In the silence and solitude of the desert, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, they had to face their own minds. They called the restlessness that arose acedia, a kind of spiritual listlessness or boredom. They understood that patience isn't just about waiting for external things. It's about being able to be with yourself, to tolerate your own company, to sit with your own experience without constantly needing to escape it. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Much of modern impatience is actually avoidance. We can't bear to be alone with our thoughts, so we fill every moment with noise and activity. We can't tolerate uncertainty, so we demand immediate answers even to questions that require careful consideration. We can't sit with difficult emotions, so we distract ourselves or numb ourselves, or try to think our way out of what can only be felt our way through. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott wrote about the capacity to be alone as a fundamental marker of psychological maturity. But this capacity isn't innate. It develops in the presence of a caregiver who allows the infant to be alone while still feeling held and safe. The child who is allowed to play by themselves while the parent does something nearby, maintaining a connection without direct engagement, develops the capacity to be with themselves. The child who experiences the parent as always either intrusive or absent, never developing this capacity to maintain a background sense of connection while being autonomous, grows into an adult who struggles with solitude. And the capacity to be alone is intimately connected with patience. If you can't tolerate being alone with yourself, you'll constantly be seeking external stimulation, external validation, external solutions to internal restlessness. You'll be impatient with any situation that forces you into your own company. Waiting rooms, commutes, quiet evenings at home, all become unbearable unless filled with distraction. But here's the gift. When you develop the capacity to be alone, when you become patient with your own company, you discover something remarkable. You're not as boring as you thought. Your own mind, when you actually pay attention to it, is endlessly fascinating. Your own experience, when you stop trying to escape it, contains depths you never suspected. The mystics of all traditions have understood this. The inward journey requires patience, because there's no destination, no achievement, no finale. There's just the endless unfolding of awareness meeting itself. Let's explore the relationship between patience and suffering more deeply. The Buddha's first noble truth is that life contains dukkha, often translated as suffering but more accurately rendered as unsatisfactoriness or dissatisfaction. The second noble truth is that this suffering is caused by tanha, often translated as craving, but more precisely understood as thirst, the desperate grasping after pleasure, and desperate fleeing from pain. The third noble truth is that suffering can end, and the fourth noble truth outlines the path to that ending. At the heart of this teaching is a profound insight about patience. Suffering doesn't end by getting everything you want immediately and avoiding everything you don't want. That's impossible. Suffering ends by changing your relationship with wanting and not wanting, by developing the patience to be with experience as it is, rather than constantly trying to manipulate it into something else. This doesn't mean becoming passive or apathetic. It means distinguishing between the pain that's inevitable in human life and the suffering we add to that pain through our impatient resistance. If you stub your toe, there's pain. That's inevitable. But then there's the layer of suffering you add by raging against the pain, by cursing yourself for clumsiness, by spiraling into frustration that this happened, by worrying about whether you've seriously injured yourself. All of that is optional. It comes from impatience with pain, from the belief that pain shouldn't happen, that you should be able to make it stop immediately. Patient acceptance of pain doesn't mean you enjoy it or seek it out. It means you stop fighting a battle you can't win, and in that stopping, you discover that the pain itself is more bearable than your resistance to it. The Christian mystics understood this too, though they framed it differently. They spoke of surrendering to God's will, of accepting suffering as part of the divine plan, of seeing trials as opportunities for spiritual refinement. Beneath the theological language is the same insight. Fighting against what is creates an additional layer of suffering. Acceptance, patient acceptance, allows you to bear what must be borne with grace instead of with bitter resistance. But let's be very clear. This isn't about accepting injustice. It's not about patiently enduring abuse or oppression. Those things should be resisted, changed, fought against. The patience we're talking about is internal, not external. It's patience with the reality that change takes time, that healing isn't linear, that growth happens through seasons. It's not patience with circumstances that should and can be changed. There's a prayer attributed to various sources, most famously Reinhold Niebuhr, that captures this distinction beautifully. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. This is the heart of wisdom patience, accepting what lies beyond your power with serenity, working to change what is within your power with courage, and having the wisdom, which often only comes through patient observation and painful mistakes, to know which is which. Often we waste enormous energy trying to change things we have no control over. We can't change other people. We can influence them, we can invite them, we can inspire them, but we can't force them to be different than they are. Impatience with other people's pace of change is one of the great sources of relationship suffering. The wife who wants her husband to be more emotionally expressive immediately. The parent who wants their adult child to make different life choices. The friend who wants you to get over your grief faster. All of that impatience adds suffering without adding change. What we can change is ourselves. And even that change requires patience. You don't transform your deeply ingrained habits overnight. You don't heal trauma with a weekend workshop. You don't develop wisdom by reading one book. The self-help industry has done us a great disservice by promising rapid transformation, 5 steps to a new you, 10 days to enlightenment. These promises feed our impatience and set us up for disappointment when change doesn't happen on the advertised schedule. Real change, lasting change, happens slowly. It happens through daily practice, through small choices repeated thousands of times, through patient attention to the patterns that no longer serve you and gentle redirection toward patterns that do. The person who meditates every day for 20 minutes doesn't have a dramatic enlightenment experience on day 17. They slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly develop a different relationship with their mind. After a year, they might look back and realize something has shifted. After 5 years, the shift is undeniable. But it happens so gradually that no single moment marked the transformation. This is true of all real development. You don't become wise by collecting insights. You become wise by living through experiences, by making mistakes and learning from them, by sitting with questions long enough that answers arise from depths you didn't know you had. Wisdom is the fruit of patience. It can't be downloaded or purchased or achieved through willpower alone. It ripens in its own time. The Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy wrote that everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves. And changing yourself requires the hardest kind of patience, because you have to live with yourself through the messy middle of transformation. You have to tolerate being a work in progress, being someone who knows better but doesn't always do better, being someone who has seen glimpses of who you could become but hasn't yet arrived. There's a concept in Japanese aesthetics called wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompletion. A tea bowl with a crack in it, repaired with gold, is more beautiful than a perfect one because it bears the marks of its history, because it has been broken and mended, because it is honestly itself rather than pretending to be flawless. We could apply this same principle to ourselves. You are not a finished product. You are a process. And there's something beautiful about being honestly in process rather than pretending you've arrived. But our culture makes this so difficult. We're surrounded by images of people who seem to have it all together, who present polished versions of themselves on social media, who market themselves as experts and gurus, who perform certainty even when they must feel doubt. This creates pressure to perform completion, to hide our struggles, to pretend we're further along than we are. And this pressure feeds impatience with ourselves and with the actual messy reality of being human. What would it be like to embrace being in process? To say, I'm working on this without shame? To acknowledge, I don't have this figured out yet, without feeling like a failure? To admit, I'm learning, without needing to prove you've already mastered it? This kind of honest humility is rare, but it's also the foundation of real growth. You can't learn what you pretend you already know. You can't grow beyond where you pretend you already are. The ancient Greek concept of kairos, which we mentioned earlier, was associated with the god Kairos, depicted as a young man with wings on his feet, a lock of hair on his forehead but bald in the back. The symbolism is clear. The opportune moment must be seized as it passes, because once it's gone, you can't grab it from behind. But how do you recognize the opportune moment? How do you know when to wait and when to act? This is where patience as a virtue intersects with wisdom as a quality. The patient person isn't simply passive. They're actively waiting, watching, attending to the signs that the moment is right. They're like the hunter who knows that thrashing through the forest will scare away the game, who knows that stillness and patience will eventually bring the deer within range, or like the surfer who waits for the right wave, letting dozens pass by because they're not quite right, and then paddling hard when the perfect wave appears. This requires a kind of trust that's difficult to cultivate. Trust that you'll recognize the moment when it comes. Trust that the waiting isn't wasted time but preparation. Trust that the universe or life or God or whatever word you use for the larger patterns that weave through existence has a timing that's wiser than your personal impatience. The I Ching, the ancient Chinese book of changes, is fundamentally a text about timing. Each hexagram represents a particular moment in the cyclical process of change, and the wisdom it offers is about how to align yourself with that moment. Sometimes the guidance is to act boldly, sometimes it's to wait patiently, sometimes it's to retreat, sometimes it's to advance. The underlying message is that there's a right time for everything, and forcing action in the wrong time is worse than inaction. Think about how much trouble comes from acting too soon or too late. The entrepreneur who launches a business before the market is ready, or after the opportunity has passed. The person who professes love too early and scares away a potential partner, or waits too long and loses their chance. The speaker who doesn't allow silence to settle before filling it with more words, missing the moment when truth might have landed. Patience isn't just about waiting. It's about timing, about sensing the ripeness of the moment. But in a culture that values speed above almost everything else, we've lost the art of timing. We want everything now, immediately, without delay. We've forgotten that just as fruit picked too early never develops full sweetness, and fruit left too long on the vine rots, there are seasons to human endeavor. There are times to push and times to rest, times to speak and times to be silent, times to act and times to wait. The writer Annie Dillard said that how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. If we spend our days in impatient rushing, in constant distraction, in frustrated resistance to the pace of reality, then that's the life we're creating. But if we can learn to meet each moment with patience, if we can cultivate the ability to be fully present without needing things to be different than they are, then our days become rich with presence and our lives become deep rather than merely long. Let's consider the relationship between patience and creativity more fully. Every artist knows the experience of creative block, of sitting in front of a blank page or canvas or screen and having nothing come. The impatient response is to force it, to try to muscle through, to demand that inspiration arrive on command. But creativity doesn't work that way. Inspiration is like a shy animal. It won't come when called, but if you sit very still and wait patiently, it might approach on its own. The composer Gustav Mahler had a practice of taking long walks in nature, sometimes for hours, without any goal or purpose except to walk. He found that symphonic ideas would often arrive during these walks, bubbling up from someplace beyond his conscious control. If he had stayed at his desk, straining to compose, nothing would have come. But by patiently giving himself space, by trusting the creative process, he allowed room for something larger than his conscious mind to work. There's a concept in Taoist thought called Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means acting in alignment with the natural flow of things rather than forcing your will against the grain of reality. It's the kind of action that seems effortless because it's properly timed and aligned. Think of a skilled martial artist who doesn't meet force with force but redirects an opponent's energy, or a sailor who doesn't fight the wind but uses it to go where they want to go. Wu Wei requires patience because it means waiting for the right moment rather than charging ahead. It means trusting that there's a current in life that will carry you if you align yourself with it, rather than exhausting yourself swimming against it. This isn't passivity. It's a kind of active receptivity, a patient attunement to what wants to happen rather than what you think should happen. In the creative process, this often means allowing work to emerge rather than forcing it. The writer who sits down every day at the same time and waits, patient with the silence until words begin to flow. The painter who prepares the canvas and then allows the painting to reveal itself stroke by stroke. The musician who practices technical exercises faithfully, patiently, knowing that mastery will arrive in its own time. But this applies beyond the traditionally creative arts. Any work done with full attention and patience becomes a kind of practice. The carpenter who measures twice and cuts once, who works with the grain of the wood rather than against it, who takes pride in craftsmanship rather than rushing to finish, the teacher who allows students to struggle with difficult concepts rather than immediately giving them the answer, knowing that understanding that's arrived at through patient effort goes deeper than knowledge that's simply handed over. The parent who waits through the chaos of childhood, maintaining faith that the child will eventually find their way, rather than anxiously micromanaging every aspect of development. This kind of patience is revolutionary in a culture obsessed with productivity, with output, with measurable results. It says that the process matters, that how you do something is as important as what you produce, that rushing to finish often produces work that lacks soul. There's a movement in food culture towards slow food, a rejection of fast food in favor of meals that take time to prepare, that honor traditional methods, that value quality over convenience. This isn't just about food, it's about reclaiming a more patient relationship with one of the most fundamental aspects of being human. When you spend hours making a meal from scratch, when you sit down to eat without distraction, when you savor each bite rather than inhaling your food while scrolling through your phone, you're practicing patience. You're saying that this moment, this experience, this simple act of nourishing yourself deserves your full attention. The same principle can be applied to every aspect of life. Slow reading, actually engaging deeply with a text, rather than skimming for information. Slow walking, moving through the world at a pace that allows you to notice things. Slow conversation, giving someone your full attention rather than waiting for your turn to talk or glancing at your phone every few minutes. Slow work, focusing on one thing at a time, rather than fragmenting your attention across multiple tasks. This isn't about romanticizing the past or pretending that technology is inherently bad. It's about recognizing that speed has costs as well as benefits, and that we've reached a point where we're paying more in costs than we're gaining in benefits. We've optimized for efficiency at the expense of depth, for productivity at the expense of meaning, for stimulation at the expense of satisfaction. And the way back isn't through self-flagellation or grim determination, it's through patience. Patient attention to what actually nourishes you versus what merely distracts you. Patient observation of your own patterns and habits. Patient experimentation with different ways of being in the world. Patient persistence in practicing presence, even though every force in modern culture pulls you toward distraction. The Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh teaches a practice called the miracle of mindfulness. The miracle isn't about achieving some special state. It's about fully inhabiting whatever you're doing in this moment. When you're washing dishes, you're fully washing dishes, feeling the warm water, noticing the slippery soap, attending to the act itself, rather than treating it as an annoying obstacle between you and some imagined future moment when you'll be doing something more worthwhile. This is the practice of patience in its most concrete form, meeting each moment as if this moment is enough, as if this moment is where life is actually happening, because it is. This is the only moment you ever have. All your past moments are gone. All your future moments haven't arrived yet. This breath, this sensation, this experience, this is where you are alive. And impatience is the constant attempt to escape from the only moment that's real into an imagined future that never quite arrives. Think about how this plays out in your own life. How often are you fully where you are? When you're at work, are you thinking about the evening? When you're with friends, are you mentally composing your to-do list? When you're eating, are you planning tomorrow? When you're in conversation, are you formulating your response instead of actually listening? This fragmentation is a form of impatience with the present moment. It's the belief that somewhere else or someone else is more important than right here, right now. But here's the paradox. When you stop trying to get somewhere else and fully arrive where you are, you often find that what you were looking for was here all along. The peace you were chasing in the future is available right now if you stop running. The connection you are seeking with others is available right now if you stop performing and become present. The sense of enoughness you thought you'd feel when you achieved something is available right now if you stop measuring yourself against imaginary standards. This doesn't mean you stop having goals or working toward things. It means you stop believing that your worth, your happiness, your fundamental okayness depends on achieving those things. You can work toward a goal from a place of patience and presence, treating the work itself as meaningful rather than just seeing it as a means to some future end. This completely changes the quality of the work and your experience of doing it. Let's turn our attention now to patience in relationships, because this might be where patience is most tested and most necessary. Every relationship, whether romantic, familial, or friendship, involves the collision of two different timing systems, two different paces, two different sets of needs and expectations about when things should happen. Consider the beginning of a romantic relationship. One person might be ready to say, "I love you," while the other needs more time. One person might want to introduce their partner to family and friends immediately, while the other prefers to keep things private for a while. One person might be thinking about moving in together while the other is still figuring out whether this is a long-term thing. These different paces can create enormous tension if there isn't patience and respect for the other person's timing. The impatient lover tries to force the pace, pushing for commitment before the other person is ready, interpreting the need for more time as rejection or lack of feeling, creating pressure that often drives the other person away. The patient lover trusts that the relationship will unfold at its own pace, that you can't force someone into deeper intimacy, that some people need more time to feel safe enough to open fully. This doesn't mean being a doormat or tolerating indefinite ambiguity. It means recognizing that people come to readiness in their own time, and that pushing someone past their genuine readiness creates a false sense of closeness that will eventually crumble. Real intimacy can't be rushed. It develops through hundreds of small moments of being truly seen and truly seeing another person, of surviving conflicts and coming back together, of building a history that creates trust. In long-term relationships, patience takes a different form. It's patience with the ways your partner doesn't meet your expectations, with the ways they're struggling with their own growth, with the reality that they're a human being with flaws and wounds and limitations just like you are. The impatient partner keeps score, builds resentment, treats every disappointment as evidence that they've chosen wrong. The patient partner recognizes that over decades together, you'll both fail each other countless times, and that those failures are opportunities to practice forgiveness, to deepen understanding, to choose love, even when it's not easy. This kind of patience doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It doesn't mean staying in a relationship that's fundamentally unhealthy or abusive. It means having the patience to work through normal relationship difficulties, rather than bailing the moment things get hard. It means recognizing that the grass isn't greener on the other side, it's greener where you water it. And watering a relationship requires the patient, daily attention of someone who's in it for the long haul. Parenting requires perhaps the most profound patience of all. Your child is not you. They don't develop according to your timetable or your preferences. They don't learn the lessons you want them to learn when you want them to learn them. They make the same mistakes over and over. They test boundaries that you've set 100 times. They require the same instructions repeated endlessly. They move at their own pace through their own developmental stages, and no amount of pushing will accelerate that process. In fact, pushing often backfires, creating anxiety or resistance rather than the growth you're hoping for. The patient parent trusts the developmental process, provides support and structure, and then gets out of the way. They understand that their job isn't to create a perfect child, but to help a child develop into whoever they're meant to become. They're patient with the fact that this process is messy and non-linear, that there will be setbacks and struggles, that their child will have to learn some things the hard way. But they're also patient with themselves as parents. They know they'll make mistakes. They know they'll lose their temper sometimes, make decisions they later regret, fail to show up in the ways they wish they had. Patient parenting includes self-forgiveness, recognizing that you're doing your best in a role that no one is fully prepared for, and that beating yourself up for imperfections doesn't serve you or your child. In friendships, patience manifests as allowing people to go through their own processes without trying to fix them or rush them, or tell them what they should be feeling. It's sitting with a friend's grief without trying to cheer them up or make them move on. It's listening to someone work through a problem out loud without jumping in with solutions. It's maintaining connection even when someone is going through a difficult phase that makes them less available than usual. We live in a culture that's so uncomfortable with difficult emotions that we're constantly trying to make people feel better. When someone is sad, we tell them to look on the bright side. When someone is angry, we tell them to calm down. When someone is anxious, we tell them not to worry. All of this is a form of impatience with their emotional process. It's saying, feel something different, something easier for me to be around. Patient friendship means allowing people to feel what they feel, trusting that emotions move through us if we don't block them, that sometimes people just need to be witnessed in their difficulty rather than rescued from it. This applies to our relationship with ourselves too. How patient are you with your own emotional process? When you're going through something difficult, do you allow yourself to feel it fully, or do you immediately start looking for ways to make the feeling go away? Do you medicate it with substances or shopping or sex or social media? Do you judge yourself for feeling what you feel? Do you compare your recovery time to others and find yourself wanting? Self-patience means treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a good friend. It means recognizing that healing isn't linear, that some days you'll feel like you've made progress, and other days you'll feel like you're back at square one, and that this is completely normal.